We are continuing in our series called Escaping Regret. And we've talked about the reality that all of us, if we look back in our past, we have decisions that we look back on that we wish we would have made differently. Choices that we made that if we were able to go back and make them again, we would make them differently, because bad choices, wrong decisions lead to consequences, and it leaves us in regret. And we've talked about how wise it is, because we cannot change the past, how wise it is for us to change the future by making better choices, by making wiser decisions. And so we've been looking at different aspects of that. Pastor Milt Eichler will wrap up our series next week when he will talk to you about sharing your faith with others around you, so that you won't look back and regret someone that you could have shared Jesus with and you didn't. And Pastor Milt will wrap up the series next week. Last week we talked about the importance of listening to godly counsel that the Lord sends into our lives. That when we come to decision points, often God will send somebody or some bodies into our life to give us His wisdom, to give us good biblical counsel. And our big idea last week was, if you won't listen, you will live with regret. And I shared with you a story from my own life that I didn't listen to godly counsel, and for years I lived with regret about that decision. Well, today we're going to talk about the unnecessary regret that we live in because we make the same mistake over and over. We make the same bad decision again and again and again, and we live with regret. In my story last week from our own life, I talked to you about a bad financial decision that I made that took us years to dig out from under. And as a part of that process, somebody gave me the advice or told me that car payments were evil. They were of the devil. That you should only buy a car you can pay cash for. Now, I don't know how you stand on that, but we came to a point that I had to have a car. This was back in the 80s when we lived in Humble, Texas. And the only car that I could pay cash for, I had about $900, was a car that looked very much like this. Yeah, except it didn't look that good. The paint didn't look that good. That's an old Ford LTD, and somebody talked me into buying that because I could pay cash for it. Well, it seemed like a good decision until in about the first week something went wrong mechanically, and it cost me almost as much as the car cost. And then not long after that, the air conditioning went out. And I don't know how many of you drive around in the summers without air conditioning, but I'm too spoiled to do that. And I had to pay for the air conditioning repair. And then after that, it was something in the suspension. And then after that, there was another mechanical issue and I later learned it was oil dripping upon the exhaust manifold. So then I drove around and the car looked something like this, with smoke coming from both directions. Do you see where I'm headed? I kept putting money into that it should have been yellow because it was a lemon. I kept putting money after money after money in that old car again and again. I finally had to sell it for far less money than I put into it. I just kept making the same mistake over and over. Have you ever heard Albert Einstein's definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. And yet, don't we do that in our spiritual lives far too often? We make the same bad decisions not once, but again and again, and we live in recurring regret because we don't learn the lesson and we can't escape regret. Here's our big idea, and if that term sounds unfamiliar to you, this is the one thing I want you to remember if you forget everything else from today's message. Here it is. If we don't learn from our bad decisions, we will repeat them. It's a simple concept, but it's so true. If we don't learn from our bad decisions, we will repeat them. Because we will make bad decisions. We are human beings. We are sinful creatures. We make unwise choices. We make bad decisions. It's just part of what we are. Everyone here has made a bad decision at some point or another. But if we learn nothing from those bad decisions, we are doomed to a cycle of bad decision to regret, to bad decision to regret. We're going to look at a story today from the book of Numbers. We're actually going to kind of pick up where our scriptural narrative left off last week with Moses and the children of Israel, the Israelites following the Exodus, their escape out of Egypt, and they're on their journey to Canaan, the promised land. And Moses is trying to lead these wayward wanderers through the wilderness. Well, that's a whole bunch of W's, and I couldn't say that again if I tried. And when things got hard, they made the mistake of being ungrateful to God, and it led to bad decisions that led to regret. So if you have a Bible, and I hope you do, open it to Numbers chapter 11. We'll look at 3 different passages, all from the book of Numbers, as we just kind of follow this narrative of the Israelites in the wilderness. Numbers 11 will begin with verse 4. If you don't have a copy of the scripture with you, follow along as the words are on the screen. Numbers 11, verse 4. Then the foreign rabble who were traveling with the Israelites began to crave the good things of Egypt. And the people of Israel also began to complain. "Oh, for some meat," they exclaimed. "We remember the fish we used to eat for free in Egypt. And we had all the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic we wanted." They made it sound like a resort, didn't they? But you remember Egypt? They were in bondage. They were doing hard labor. And during that time, they cried to God that they might be set free. And God worked a miracle, and now they were free, but they found something else to be unhappy about. It was their menu. Verse 6, "But now all our appetites are gone. All we ever see is this manna." And then the narrative describes this miracle food that they spoke of with such disgust and disdain, this food that God gave them every day for free. Verse 7. The manna looked like small coriander seeds, and it was pale yellow like gum rosin. The people would go out and gather it from the ground. They made flour by grinding it with hand mills or pounding it in mortars. Then they boiled it in a pot and made it into flat cakes. And look at this. These cakes tasted like pastries baked with olive oil. I mean, actually, this food, this manna, was an incredibly versatile food. I'm sure somebody came up with a cookbook, 365 ways to cook manna. I mean, there was all kinds of stuff. Pastries baked with olive oil, it tasted. And it just came. They didn't have to go to Brookshire's or Arlen's or H-E-B or wherever you shop to get it. God provided it every day. Look at verse 9. The manna came down on the camp with the dew during the night. God provided it every day. Think about it. Free food provided every day. All the food they would ever need. You would think surely they would be grateful and appreciative for their daily bread. But no, verse 10. Moses heard all the families standing in the doorways of their tents, whining. And the Lord became extremely angry. Moses also was very aggravated. Let me give you a big shocker. It's not a good thing to make God angry. It's not a good thing. It's not a good thing to be ungrateful for God's gracious provision, but it wasn't just them. That's a problem with us. It is a bad decision to be ungrateful to God for what you've been given. You want to know one of the greatest benefits of being involved in compassion, especially if you get the privilege, like a team of our people will leave a week from today to go to Honduras and see our children there and see their church projects and the people who care for them, especially if you get to visit. But even just writing letters and you begin to see the world of these children living in poverty, you want to know one of the greatest blessings? We suddenly wake up to the reality of how blessed we are. How blessed we are. And yes, we can look around us and we can find people who have more than we do. But in our own community, you can look around and find people who have a lot less than we do. But the reality is, every one of us is incredibly blessed by God. And it is a bad decision to be ungrateful to God for what you've been given. And it's even more than a bad decision. I want to contend today, it sets off a chain reaction. It moves you in a progressive way towards something that you don't want to experience. Ingratitude will lead to discontent, which will lead to a bad decision. That's where the Israelites were. And I'm going to be brave and bold enough to say, I think that may be where some of us may be today. And we don't even realize it. But we're ungrateful to God. We talk far more about how bad things are than how blessed we are. And when you live, even if you're not aware of it, if you live in ingratitude, it gives rise to discontent. And when you begin to live in discontent, you are that close to one, if not a series, of bad decisions. Now, if this was the only time that the Israelites had made this bad decision to be ungrateful to God, it would be bad enough. But no. The next scene that we will look at, the Israelites and Moses are right at the edge of the promised land. They've come right up into Canaan. And Moses sends 12 spies, if you will, men who went into the promised land of Canaan to do reconnaissance, to see about the pagan inhabitants of the land that God had said would be driven from the land so that the people of God could inhabit it. And these 12 men go into the land and they find that the land was beautiful and fruitful and fertile, but the inhabitants were big and scary. And they come back and report to Moses and the people, we can't conquer this land, even though God had promised it to them. And then Caleb spoke up among them with great faith. Let's see it. Numbers 13, verse 30. But Caleb tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. Let's go at once and take the land, he said. We can certainly conquer it. But the other men who had explored the land with him disagreed. We can't go up against them. They are stronger than we are. So they spread this bad report about the land among the Israelites. The land we traveled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. All the people we saw were huge. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers. And that's what they thought too. Chapter 14, verse 1. Then the whole community, here's their bad decision. Then the whole community began weeping aloud, and they cried all night. Their voices rose in a great chorus of protest against Moses and Aaron. And here's what they said. If only we had died in Egypt, or even here in the wilderness, they complained. Why is the Lord taking us to this country only to have us die in battle? Our wives and our little ones will be carried off as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt? Then they plotted among themselves, let's choose a new leader and go back to Egypt. Really? Back to Egypt thing again? God had promised them the land. He had promised them they would be victorious. And yet they made a bad decision to disbelieve